Sangate Bodhi Swaha Gate Gate Bara Gate Bara Sangate Bodhi Swaha Gate Gate Bara Gate Bara Sangate Bodhi Swaha Gate Gate Bara.
Mingalaba, for any Burmese language speakers tuning in today, we wanted to let you know that our Better Burma mission has launched 3 Burmese language podcasts: Myanmar Revolutionary Tales, Dark Era of Burma, and Myanmar Peace, Women, and Security. These programs can be found on our website as well as on any of your preferred podcast platforms. We invite you to take a listen. But for now, let's get on with this episode. So I'm back here with Jonathan Crowley. We had a brief introductory talk about his beginning meditation practice and the vipassana tradition of S.N. Goenka, and we're just going to get a bit deeper into what that experience was like in those years and pick up from where we left off last time. So, Jonathan, you ready to start again here?
Yeah, thanks so much, Joa. Good to be here.
Yeah, right. So when we left off before, you had, to bring listeners back in who had listened before, or perhaps those who are starting with this one, although we suggest to check out that one first. You had described how your emerging meditation practice had began and the difficulty as it is for so many of us, and then coming into wanting to dedicate yourself more and more, have it become a bigger and bigger part of your life. And eventually that led to sitting and serving, being one of the first sitter servers in Dhamma Dhara in Massachusetts, to basically live at the center and be participating in most courses that were happening and really try to get, as they say, established in the technique and established in the tradition. That was kind of where we left off. So why don't we pick back up there in your journey and go in terms of what you were doing, what you were feeling, how you were developing, how you were changing, anything you want to talk about those years.
Yeah. It was an extraordinary time, a really precious time for me. And I landed at the center and began basically alternating retreats. I would sit a retreat and then volunteer, basically either in the kitchen or sometimes as course manager, and did that for, I think, about 8 to 9 months. Consecutively, and it was a very intense time. And the center was in a pretty early. It was still in some of its early stages of development in terms of expanding its residences, and so there, and then I was also there by myself, or actually, I think there was actually one other server who was there with me during the winter months, because all of the trustees and ATs who were operating the center would leave for approximately 2 months and go to India to attend longer retreat centers, courses there. So there were months where they were just visiting ATs who would come to the center from either Canada or other places and teach, conduct the courses. And I was just there kind of holding the fort with this other server. And yeah, it was a fascinating time. And there were, and then there was this sense of, with each retreat sort of going deeper into practice, understanding the practice at a deeper level. And then this sense of the service being a kind of way to integrate that practice in the context of being a volunteer, which is more, it's a more extroverted position. You're cooking, you're cleaning, you're interacting with other volunteers, either in the kitchen or with the ATs who are teaching the course, conducting the course. So it was like entering a completely new world, and I was very open to it. It was very fulfilling to me on many levels. I had a real thirst to sit a lot, and that was it was really fulfilling that. And I was also going through a lot of changes, a lot of you might say kind of, I don't know, existential or metaphysical, sense of who I was and in the world and what the world was about. Um, Similar to my first course, because in some ways, I think I might have mentioned after my first course, it was, there were, initially it was, I would say, it was a destabilizing event in some ways. It was an extraordinary event in the sense that I felt like I achieved a lot just by getting through the 10 days, but it was also, it uprooted a lot of who I thought I was. And that continued for 6 months in an acute way. I really didn't know what was up and what was down, or what my life was about, or what direction I should go. It called into question so many different things. But by the time I had landed at the center to sit and serve, I was getting to, I'd gotten to know the center a little bit, and, realized, okay, this is a world here, and let me enter this world. And so as I was entering this world, it, it was interesting. It was interesting to see that, oh, this is a whole entire world. Like what I did, when I sat my first Indie course was not just this, standalone fringe activity. It's like there's a whole world of people doing this over, sitting these courses over and over again, volunteering on these courses, teaching these courses. It's like an entire whole world. And so there was a process really of getting to know the organization, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. I'm just thinking about the words that you chose and when you were describing your experiences during this time. And I noticed that side by side, you use the word fulfilling to talk about entering more deeply into that experience. And you also use the word uprooted and not knowing what was up and down. And at face value, these things seem like they're somewhat contradictory, that something could be deeply fulfilling. Being fulfilling has a sense of being able to navigate something in a satisfactory way. And being uprooted feels like, well, not knowing what was up from down, as you said. So at face value, it appears there's some contradiction, but maybe going deeper into it, there's a way these are integrated, or that these two parallel experiences happening sequentially or side by side or off and on make some kind of sense. So how would you describe that apparent contradiction at the face level?
It's a great question. And I think, I would guess that a lot of meditators feel this way as they enter into retreats, that the retreat provides in some ways a container, for which to plumb and uproot aspects of identification in the sense of like questioning who you are, or, I think that occurs on a typical 10-day retreat with Goenka in a profound way, in the sense that you are experiencing let's see if I can describe this, just observing the breath every moment, observing sensations every moment. You are in some ways disidentifying from what you think you are, or who you think you are, to just this bare experience, right? And I think there is an uprooting that occurs in that process, but it's in many ways it's contained while you're at least on the retreat. There's a structure. You're following the instructions. You've got a schedule, and in some ways that began to then occur kind of writ large while living at the center. So I would sort of come in and out of those experiences in succession. And in some ways, I began to become more, used to the sense of uprooting, the sense of like, as I experienced different levels of even my own consciousness, different levels of my mind, and thought, okay, or experience, profound moments of peace or disturbing aspects of my mind as well. I remember there was a time, I was on some retreat then, and looking at the wall, the patterns of the wall, they began to move, and they started to form these kind of negative, impressions on the wall. And I thought, oh my God, am I going crazy here? And, how do I snap at, but I could also see that was in some ways part and parcel of the process of, breaking down sort of structures of my ego or of my perceptions or of even, my emotions in right across the board. So yeah, so there is this uprooting, just you could say even disturbing, destabilizing way, and yet it brings you to these depths, right? It brings you to these insights. It brings you to these, with time, and of course sometimes it does take time to integrate it, and I think and digest it. But in some ways, the process of living in the center allowed me to do this in succession and get used to that process of entering into this uprooting world. And in some ways, that's the way, the Goenka's courses and retreats are talked about. It's like there's an expectation you're going to go in, you're going to contact a level of impermanence that's going to, in some ways, rock your world, and disturb it and come to new insights as a result of it. Right. And so, and sometimes that can be temporarily, psychologically, disturbing or unsettling. And it could take time to kind of integrate, so there were sometimes I would come off courses and it would take time, but I was doing these in succession, and even, volunteering as a server on the courses, you're undergoing some of that as well, as, even though you're in a position of facilitating that for others to some degree, you're also still undergoing that yourself. Yeah, you're right. It's a kind of a paradox. There's a lot of structure, and yet that structure is allowing you to, in some ways, crack the cosmic egg or slip through the cracks to the basement of your being, and be in that basement, and do that deep work, and then kind of come back, extrovert back up, and then integrate into the world as best you can, and hopefully that is successful, as you integrate insights or deeper realities with deeper truths within you.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember when I did my first course, one of my big questions to myself is, how is this even legal? How do they even let you, how is it even legal to join this thing where it allows me to do a practice which breaks down all of reality and convention as I know it, and explore this in an actual experience and not in words of the books I was reading at the time. And I think it also has to be said that this is not unique to Goenka. It's not even unique to meditation. Right. You look at psychotherapy or experiences in nature or anything else, and there's life brings with it struggle, and there's whatever framework one is working with, whether it's religious or psychological or societal or anything else. There are things that are incomplete within oneself and that are not functioning to their best degree and are damaged for whatever reason, whatever way. And to look at that is a painful process. That has to be said. In whatever form you use, if you're not going through some kind of unsettling, the very process of learning, I say this as someone who studied learning acquisition theory in my professional life, and even just teaching a language or teaching a new concept. I remember courses where we studied the neuroscience of that, and it's painful to integrate new information, even if that new information is how to conjugate verbs in another language, or what actually were the real causes of World War I, or whatever one is studying. there is the learning process unsettles and upsets and uproots what we thought we know or what we didn't know. And it's not a question of just implanting this new language. It's a question of having to integrate this new information with everything we are at this time. And that the way that the neuroscience was explained to me at the time was that breaks apart the existing structure in order to integrate this new information and understanding with it. And that is the process of life every day. And so the deeper the learning experiences and the more intensive they are and the nature of them, the one is going to pass through those unsettling periods. So that, so just to put some of your experience in context as I understand it and mention that, that being said, you talk about these really profound insights that you're having from the practice that are starting to question everything and starting to you're having to figure out how to integrate these within intensive core structure that's perfectly set up, and you have these profound insights, learning how to take those insights and then integrate them into actual life. That can be a challenge for people as well, learning the effective way to do that and the relationship between these. But so I wonder if you can talk a little bit more specifically about the types of insights that you were having and how they were rocking your world, how you were trying successfully and unsuccessfully to integrate them. And then through all of this, how you were changing as a person as you were becoming involved, not just in the practice, but also the community.
Yeah, a lot there to cover there, but I'll do my best here. And I was also ingesting, Goenka's framework, right? And I think, as many of your other Goenka students have on this show have described, it is a actively sort of deconstructing process, right? You're sort of through the process of observing your breath, sensations, and developing equanimity. The framework is described as a purification process whereby the more you bring equanimity to the observation of this changing phenomenon, the more your mind then can plumb ever deeper layers and depths to deeper and deeper, more subtle insights into the reality of life, or the reality of being. And so, I was experiencing that on in sort of typical. Probably typical ways. I mean, again, I'm in my early 20s. I'm sitting sort of my third to eighth retreat, in this time period, and I'm assimilating Goenka's framework around this. And I think that's an important piece to remember, is that I'm adopting that framework and internalizing it, and as I'm going. And it at that time, it of course it really it articulated and complemented many other aspects of that kind of work maybe at a deeper level. So I had already come into this work, with a kind of a healing framework, a psychotherapeutic framework, and this notion of sort of peeling back the layers was definitely there for me. And so that was what was going on my retreats. I would challenge myself, of course, with Goenka's famous sittings of strong determinations, or the adhitanas, where you try not to move for an hour and really work to develop your equanimity for whatever is going to happen in that hour. And those were very sort of profound, sort of gave me sort of a sense of profound accomplishment to do that, but also just that I was experiencing, I don't know. I mean, it was so, in some ways, it's such a metaphysical experience of reality in my being, just sitting with pain, for example, or with, and when I say the word pain, it doesn't even describe really what it is. It's almost like an existential, feeling that may, may not be physically painful, but it was, the mind, but you're just sitting with that. And it's as if I don't know, sometimes I would feel like I was in this, traveling through this kind of tunnel of my being, and whatever was kind of coming, in the forefront of my screen or through me or in me, I was just being with. And I had the sense of, okay, this is valuable to do this, right? This is important. I'm going to get to some other side. I'm going to get to a sense of liberation because of this. Again, according to Goenka's framework, this was a liberating process, right? So the more equanimity I brought to these existentially disturbing experiences within my being, the more I was also clearing the slate of my mind and peeling back layers and as he would articulate, purifying those layers, right? So, and I did come off courses, really feeling a sense of lightness and feeling an incredible, I don't know, subtlety in my mind, subtlety in my perceptions, an innocence. Actually, that word came up a lot for me. I felt like I was recapturing my own innocence. And that was quite magical for me. That was quite, I just felt like I was, able to just like, have this childlike mind again, and all of that was, it was absolutely transformative and magical, really. I mean, it was just, I was just like, oh my God, this is like, again, this is, I think I described before, coming, it's like a secret superpower, and then to see how the practice of loving kindness, filled in that space of innocence and purity and this lightness of mind and this openness, this spaciousness that I would come off the retreats with. It was incredible. And, it had been a few years, but, I had certainly gone through my spate of recreational drugs and, hallucinogenics. And so the fact that, and I was aware of the whole movement around that, I had gone to see Ram Dass speak, and I knew the whole story there and, of his experiments. And so the fact that this was happening in a drug-free environment that was based on morality, on the 5 precepts of, not harming, it was just so revelatory on so many levels, in terms of just how it was changing me. And yeah, and then of course it was also getting to know other people who were doing that same thing, doing sit serving, and that was their world, and that they were trying to make it happen, based on their livelihood or their circumstances in life and how they fit that in. And of course, as I was in my early 20s and I hadn't completed college, and there were a lot of question marks around that for me, around that process. And so this was so captivating. And it, when I thought about, going back to college, I was like, well, why? This is such profound work, why would I want to do anything else? And so in many ways, I began to then think about both ways to integrate it, and ways to continue doing this in some ways. And the I guess the question and the task became, okay, yeah, if I have to go back to work or have to go back to school, how do I integrate, what's happening here, and how do I begin to articulate this to myself about what's happening, in my own words. So that was, if that's helpful, that's kind of what was happening for me. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great to hear. And it's really interesting you land on the word innocence. That's such a powerful term, and it brings back and conjures so much. It reminds me of my very first course in Japan, after a few days of Anapana, walking out in the outside men's walking area and just starting to stare at like spider webs and dew on the leaves and other things. And I remembered that I grew up an only child in Northern California in pretty rural countryside, so it wasn't like a typical neighborhood. And so I spent a lot of my childhood playing outside by myself. And we didn't have TV reception; we were in the redwoods, and so it was. I had to fill a lot of hours, and I filled a lot of those hours by just playing in the redwoods by myself, inventing my own games and everything else. And when I saw the dew on the spider webs and the creek flowing, I remembered that sometime earlier in my childhood, this innocence of that was the only thing that filled it. And there was only the mind for that. And it was this shock to me that I had lost that. And I had no idea. I had forgotten that I had it. And then I didn't realize that I had lost it. And suddenly I was here in this garden recapturing this. I mean, as I'm saying this, it almost sounds like, Marcel Proust or something, the taste of the sweet cake that brings you back to this childhood thing. But this pristine memory that had imbued and filled my childhood, that suddenly my mind, and this was 2001. So this was, long before the age of streaming and mobile phones and everything else that's further distracted us. But still, I just felt that I had come down and returned to some youthful innocence where the beauty and the magic and the unpredictability of the natural world was the only thing that was there. And then, of course, as I went further into the practice, I realized, it's not just about this. It's not just about clearing your mind and then appreciating the beauty of a dragonfly or a stream flowing or something. It's actually this deep mental purification work, and that was really a transformation in my own path. Is realizing it was not just a subconscious exploration and a cleaning of the senses to come back to center and appreciate just a more simple, the simplicity that can fill the life. But it's actually, as I started to understand Goenka's instructions in more detail on future courses, a deep cleaning out of the mental impurities and defilements, which set me on a very directed and concentrated, I would say even rigid path of no longer really having the same time for, the simplified view of the dew on the spider webs, because I was walking with eyes downcast and following instructions very carefully about the technique to get the most out of it and everything else. I'm just kind of going off on my own reflection as I hear that. What I actually wanted to follow up with you on is that hearing your talk just now, what really strikes me and what really stands out is not so much what you're saying, but how you're saying it. And from all the recorded conversations we've had up until now and all of the many, many more unrecorded conversations we have, there was something emerging and breaking through in this last bit you shared that was beyond, again, what you were saying, but how you were saying it. There was this all-consuming joy and participation and belief in the energy of how you were describing it and how what you were doing at that time and what feeling you were putting into it. And I think somehow in describing, and maybe you can tell me if I'm reading too much into things, but somehow in how you were describing that period, some energy of your life from how it actually was like to live in that period seemed to come up and animate how you were reflecting and thinking about it. So you weren't just remembering and recalling a time, but you were actually in some way living back through in just a small way who you were during that period. And it was, your voice was animated by that sense of excitement and purpose and passion and joy and everything else. And so I wonder if you can go in that direction and just explore, like, if that is the case, if there was something you were feeling as you went through those descriptions, and then kind of unpack that. What does that mean? What is that feeling? And how did it come to characterize you then? Why did it, what was capturing about what you were doing and how you were doing it that was just so powerful and who you were at the time?
Yeah. Well, and again, going back to that sense of innocence that you're describing, I mean, it did become way more than that, but I think at the core of almost all of my retreats, I would contact that sort of sense of profound innocence and openness and almost like an original mind, kind of experience. And it really was in some ways, I think, part of drove me to kind of continue to sit retreats. But also, like you, I needed to, I knew I was obviously ingesting and adopting and working Goenkaji's framework, but I also needed to, I at the same time, I needed to discover a context for a broader context for that, and I naturally, was raised, in an academic kind of way, in terms of high school and early college, and my family, my father was definitely an academic and intellectual, and so I needed to really understand context. But it really was that, pure kind of, innocence that I was contacting retreat after retreat after retreat that was so transformative. And I think yeah, and I feel it now. I mean, I would say I think it is a quality of Dhamma, right? It is a quality, that sense of upliftment and joy and enthrallment, really. It's I think it's, part and parcel of any path in the Dhamma. And I was seeing that in many ways, the experience of sitting these retreats was recovering something very deep and profound and old within me, something very basic, something very pure, something, and it was extremely thrilling to be experiencing that. And I still feel that way. Like I can still relate to what that was like for me in my early 20s. And it was also clear that it was kind of like this, it was almost like this, like, best kept secret. Like, I realized, of course, that it took enormous efforts. I mean, just to undergo a 10-day retreat is an enormous undertaking. And that, throngs of people were not going to be attracted to that. And so it was just also interesting to me to see, okay, so, but yet there's this group of people here at the center and other people who are kind of coming in and out of the center, the public. But at that time, this was now 1988, and it still seemed to be still quite fringe. This was not something that I was hearing about in the news and reading about in the papers. There was very little in the media about the notion of taking retreats like this, and certainly not, in succession. So I was aware that what I was doing was quite unusual, and that it was kind of askance to everything that I had been conditioned to do in society. And so I was also becoming aware that, okay, I'm also entering into a rarefied kind of world that is, not mainstream, that is secluded, that is apart. And I became aware of that. I needed to figure out, okay, what are the words that how do I articulate this to even just my circle of friends, my college friends, my family, how do I make sense to them about what I'm doing and why I'm doing it? And sometimes at that time there was no easy answers, and luckily, just based on kind of well, I'm just going to say, my privilege as a white man, and also just my family upbringing and my family of origin, the dynamics were such that I was able to take this time and kind of, dip through the cracks of society and do something completely non-conformative, non-mainstream, and see where it led me.
I think what's really interesting at this, that you're breaking through to not just be retelling, but actually reliving what this was like at the time, and bringing up those memories and feelings, and who you were and how you started to become accustomed to it. And yeah, I remember with my friends, with my also young to mid 20s, and mostly in Asia at that time. And then eventually I started, my first few years were all in Asia before I had any experience at an American Vipassana center. So it was more, the types of people I was with were also somewhat, the Westerners at least, were somewhat away from home and living those kind of lives. And I just remember we would be out doing things between courses and just be like, this is amazing. Like, this is free, and we don't need anything. There's nothing we need to buy. There's nothing we need to do. We could just sit, and maybe that's what you talk about, the special power. You could just sit there, shut everything off, and go to observation and find this extraordinary peace and possibility uh, and and renewal that I never knew was possible. I didn't. It's not a supplement. It's not a drug. It's not a life experience. It's just, and it's also not sitting and doing nothing. I mean, meditation is not, at least this meditation is not sitting and doing nothing. It's just a refocus of your attention to something else, which has these kind of profound results that I never thought could be possible. And like you, I thought, and I think many young people that go onto it, there's definitely an evangelicism that can come with it, of feeling like, if this is so good for me, this should also be good for everyone I know. And this should also be good for all of society. And imagine what would happen to the world if people did this, and kind of moving beyond oneself and just thinking about the incredible harmony one has, and also just with that, when one really is at harmony and at peace, however one finds it, there can be a genuine wish that, boy, I wish others could also feel this thing I'm feeling. This is just a really good thing to feel, other than, I know what it's like when you don't feel this. So also I'm going back and remembering as I was passing through those periods, and just the new possibilities. On one hand, the new possibilities and horizons and potentials that were there that I had never known, because I had never directed my mind towards those possibilities. And yet also the incredible confusion and about integration and who I was and how to take this and how to bring practice into who I was as a person and how I dealt in the world and everything else. There was just, and being young and having your whole career ahead, what do I want in terms of family or career or money or security or just a renunciate spiritual practice, which, like, it seems this gives me all I want in the moment. And so why do I need anything else? And do I need anything else? And of course, Cuenca is not a monastic society. It does not encourage people to be monastics. It very much does the opposite. And it's very different from a place like Burma, where going into a renunciate monastic life is very much a possibility. And there's many reasons why people do. It's sometimes, but very rarely, the reasons of one just wanting to aim for the higher spiritual echelons. There's many, it's much more complicated and much more that goes on there. But for Westerners, that's usually the thing pretty much driving it, is that motivation and that sense of why would I want anything more when the moment does fulfill me? And then what does this mean? How do I construct a life out of this?
Yeah. Well, just resonating with, that process of, both such a deep introspection and then looking outside. Okay, this is giving such great benefit, and how, how does this, who is this attracting, and what is the world of doing this? And Goenkaji, of course, he, you begin to hear in the 10-day course, that it's like, may more and more people, come to these courses and these retreats and experience, this Dhamma. And I, now sitting and serving at the retreat center, I was becoming part of the mechanism by which that was happening. I was fielding phone calls from the public, with applicants who, had questions about the retreats, and was stepping into, in some ways, that representational role where I was, playing, I was being that advocate for this experience, and that was in some ways a gradual, in some ways a slow process, both at the same time. But it began, in many ways, seeing how it impacted other people, to see how it was being written about, to begin to even read the context of the Buddhist teachings, to begin to read the early suttas, which I began to do during this time. All of that was contributing to this sense of like this world being actually in some ways much bigger than I realized, and that it might be possible, that my family might join me in this experience, or my closest friends and my college friends, or and that then began to happen as I think began to articulate it and began to normalize this experience, which was so unbelievably unnormal and extraordinary, right? But as it normalized and I was able to articulate it and was then, facilitating it as a volunteer for others, whether I was debriefing their retreats after having cooked for them, or fielding their application questions, or phone calls to the center, so I began to then internalize this whole apparatus, right? I began to serve it and represent it really during this time, during these 8 months. And it was certainly at a beginning level, I was just a volunteer, but I was, when you're asked to be the course manager, there's a sense of a lot of responsibility there, or even the kitchen manager, cooking for the whole group. It's a huge responsibility. You then, you get this larger sense of serving a larger cause, right? And that piece began to then be a part of this experience. And so again, just to reiterate that there's this profound inner experience, transformational experience, and then a sense of cause, even a mission in the world, that began to develop in me around, okay, here is a mechanism by which the world could transform in a similar way. What I'm seeing happen in myself. Oh my gosh, what impact could this have, on society, on all the parts of society that I, in some ways, was probably trying already, thinking I needed to heal from or transform, or wish were different, or, could this, really transform the world, is the question I began to ask myself.
Yeah, certainly. And whether one is looking at like racism, or problems with the environment, or problems with division in America, or poverty, or whatever else, it seems that there was a feeling, at least for me, that all of this time trying to actually do this messy stuff to figure out was just based on people acting blindly from their impurities, and that if they just were able to look at those impurities and sit with them, that so many of the terrible things that had happened in history up until now, and with the modern problems that we had, were from people reacting blindly to impurities and to sensations, rather than developing the wisdom to be able to grow from them, learn from them, be equanimous, and that so much would be solved if you can just do that. And for me to go from having an experience initially that I couldn't even believe was legal to then trying to figure out how to integrate it somewhat into me, and also integrate into the community, and then look at my wider web of contacts as well as the overall world and those issues, it gave a sense of profound confidence. And, in some ways I look back at that confidence, I cringe, and I'm ashamed of conversations I remember having, which I need to share in the in this kind of podcast discussion of vulnerability and recalling these. But I remember conversations in grad school where people were talking about problems of racism in society and examining privilege and things like that. And I don't remember how I said it, but I think I remember saying something about how, because of the path that I was on, everything was going to take care of it for me. I was good. And that I had a practice that was going beyond the duality of race that people were mired in, and that I was, I was basically good in my behavior and my contribution to this. And at the same time, one of the things that I often remark on, and this is a big tangent, so I'm not gonna give examples, but just bring it up as a bookmark to where we're talking, is that Burma is an incredible country when you look at historically, in the sense that there have been many iterations of wanting to bring the perfect practice or the perfect Buddhism to a system of governance from the top level down to grassroots, and believing that this will be a transformational change. And I think there's no greater example than U Nu, who was the democratic leader after World War II, after independence, before the military coup took over in 1962. By all accounts, U Nu was an incredible man, a very devout Buddhist, a very committed meditator. At one point, the Karen Rebellion had nearly taken over the country and was just about to take over Yangon. He was sitting a self 60-day course and refused to be disturbed from his course to attend to the Karen Rebellion, which could topple his government. And there are just so many examples of how U Nu took measures to bring not just like religious Buddhism, but actually like vipassana practice, which was that was then the movement was taking off in Burma. Before this was the movement that captured Goenka, which then captured the hippies, which then captured the world. And this was all starting from Lady Sayadaw and Mahasi Sayadaw in Burma at this time. And U Nu was seeing this as the new Burmese identity, and really, so much of this world mindfulness movement can be traced back to government initiatives that U Nu did. I mean, you think that Sayagyi U Ba Khin was a government minister who was receiving not just permission, but actually benefits from transforming his office into a shrine room where religious chanting and meditation instructions and religious figures and monks and other people could come and give instructions on Buddhism in government premises. And it's just, it's so shocking to realize that the foundation of the worldwide mindfulness movement, and, certainly Goenka, came from government benefits to religious practice, which is something that we have very different opinions on here. And anyway, to make a long story short, because this is a fascinating subject, and I can go on and on when I start to bring it up.
But what you bring up is important, because I think it has to do with the attraction, at least for, it sounds like, what I'm hearing you say, but also for me, it was like connecting the personal to the political. Right. And we began to hear these stories just right in the 10-day course, the recorded 10-day courses, right, of the role that Sayagyi played, right, in terms of bringing this to his government offices, and that ideal, right, the ideal of bringing something, such a personal development tool, you might say, or a transformative tool, meditation, to a government, political context, right, and the hope that that was, I think, beginning to instill in me, became a big piece of my sense of mission around continuing with this tradition, with Goenkaji's tradition. Yeah.
Yeah, to put a cap on what I'm saying, I mean, what's so fascinating was that in U Nu, you have the example of a legitimately bona fide, devout and committed, not just Buddhist, but Vipassana meditator who believes in Vipassana meditation as the solution to his country gaining independence and capturing its identity, and wanting to bring the individual personal benefits of the practice to the country writ large in terms of government policy in all kinds of ways I can go into if we had time. But the point of it is it was disastrous. It was absolutely disastrous. It not just failed, but it made things 10 times, 100 times worse by what he was doing. And so, and even today with the NUG, you see some of what I would call some of the more beneficial and ethical and beautiful parts of the Buddhist practice coming into play, and trying to be taken from the individual level of practice and ethics and living to the government bureaucracy level, and it's absolutely failing, and it doesn't work. And so for me, this, and we're jumping way ahead, and we'll get back to your story and tie this in, because I do think there's a tie in there. But to me, it was just, going from being this naiveté, or to use the word we said before, innocent feeling, that this profound superpower that I had for peace and wholesomeness and wholeness and everything else that was a way forward that I had never believed in or found before, that if other people could just also find the way to not react to their sensations and to their defilements, that we can resolve things never thought possible to resolve before. Fast forward to seeing those experiments played out in Burma to some effect and seeing absolutely disastrous results and leaving, well, okay, where does this fit into, where's the practice individual and how do you bring it to community? And where do you then need to maybe leave behind the practice and look at actually good practices for whatever you're doing? And this all gets more convoluted, but I want to tie that in and bring that back into your story, because this is jumping ahead and bringing in other concepts and, bringing in 20th century Burmese history and all other kinds of stuff. Getting back to your story, you're a progressive New Englander who's New York/New Yorker, who's been into these kind of healing and therapeutic kind of practices, and you're coming from an intellectual background, this practice, which has now benefited you so much in such surprising ways. You're becoming so integrated into this community. Your world is growing bigger, and you're starting to also play with this idea of how can this technique and practice, which is giving so much benefit on an individual level, how can this be applied to then heal the world, or at least heal the community or the state or something else? So talk a bit about that transformation and what you were like through those periods.
Yeah. Great question. It began to tap into my deepest ideals, essentially. And yet, and of course, as you know, the Goenkaji tradition is run on a donation basis, as dana, and that, watching how that actually functioned was part of some of the idealism that was occurring for me, in the sense that I knew I could really trust, the organization engendered a lot of trust because of the level of just integrity that it was doing, certain functions, but certainly the finances, the donation basis, that people were not even paying for their retreats. They were paying forward according to their means, according to their volition. I watched hundreds of times as, people would offer just $1 or $5 at the donation table at the end of their 10-day retreats, and that it was completely, genuinely, smilingly accepted. And that had really profound effects on me. I said, "Oh my gosh, this is really open to everyone." But then I began to also ask myself, okay, who is it not available to? And that, as I was living there for those 8 or 9 months, that question, really intrigued me. Like, okay, who doesn't get to benefit from this in our society? And I don't think I realized it at the time, but I think there were some social justice orientations in me that was asking that question and was wanting to explore that. And I began to at least answer that on some levels, because while I was there, I was opening the mail, and many times was opening a letter from an incarcerated individual that was writing to the center for either materials or to have a pen pal, or to see if somehow they could understand more about what we were doing. And it started to dawn on me, oh, okay, this, folks who are incarcerated are very unlikely they're going to have this experience. And that became something that really, intrigued me and drew me in, as I, responded to some of these inmates, and figured out ways that we were able to donate some of the information, sometimes just the information booklets about the center and the practice, but sometimes some books, and began to also, write back and forth with some of these folks about their situation and about how, what it was like on the inside. And that, that really began to intrigue me. So that was one department. And then the other thing that I saw that was really quite profound when I was there for serving for those 8 or 9 months is that Cambodian refugees were being settled in Massachusetts, and the center began to receive, basically host, Khmer courses, so Khmer retreats that were just bilingual Khmer English, exclusively for, or maybe it wasn't exclusive, but there would be, busloads of Cambodian folks who had been, who were recently being resettled in Massachusetts, coming to the retreat and taking the retreat in their language. And I thought, oh my gosh, how amazing that, these recent immigrants who have been through an unspeakable trauma are contacting, their culture's practices at this level and able to, my supposition was to, heal from the trauma they had been in and, kind of regain a sense of community in the United States. So there were these places where I began to see, oh, okay, there's some inroads into which this practice could actually, can benefit, larger entities within society. And that began to attract me and intrigue me, and that became that became a focus for me. But before that, I got really into that. I was still in my own process of integration, and it was during those 8 to 9 months that my two brothers, my two brothers came and sat a retreat. And then at the very end of it, my mother came and sat a retreat. And so, to experience, this, this activity with my family was another whole level of kind of healing, you might say, in my life. I have a twin brother, so we've historically had this very, very deep connection. We're fraternal twins, but we've just always had this kind of very, very deep sense of connection. And so when he came, and I was, I forget if I sat the same retreat with him or whether I was serving. I think I sat the same retreat with him, his first retreat, and it was just, we always talked about, this sense of being in a womb together. Well, there was nothing more womb-like than the experience of being on this retreat. And so, and then, my older brother, who, had already by this time, been suffering from some mental illness, I watched him undergo this experience and then saw him at the end of it, and to see his face, I have a photo of him, on the day that he broke silent, with just such a face full of loving kindness and metta, and it was profound. It was absolutely profound to see that on my older brother. And so, just to describe a situation where it was like, seeing this go from my own experience, I knew nobody when I first sat a retreat, to then discovering a kind of a community and a world of people, from even, outside applicants who were coming from all over the country or from Canada or from all over the world. And then to watch my family enter, this same place, I thought, it was really, again, this sense of idealism around, this can spread, and I began to internalize that messaging from Goenkaji about the spread of Dhamma, right? And I think what I didn't realize, and we can elaborate further, was that for Goenkaji, the spread of Dhamma, I think, really was the spread of his framework of the Dhamma. And in some ways, I had no distinctions at that time of anything else, right? So it was the Dhamma for me. His framework was the entire Dhamma. And even though I was also at the same time discovering a larger context, there were books, I was reading Theravada books and understanding that there were other traditions in other countries, Southeast Asian countries, besides Myanmar, besides India, and so I was sort of beginning to get a lay of the land as well. But this was all a process of, you might say, stepping into the world with this practice and with, in some ways, this tradition as well. like I say, it felt very fringe when I first began to sit retreats. But as time went on, I began to see that, more and more, regular working folks, corporate folks, from all, spectrums of conventional, sort of society were coming to sit retreats. And it was just like, wow, okay.
Mm. So you're describing a process that's going basically from fringe to validation, from something that you have to be in the right place at the right time to even hear about. And believe me, I've heard those stories from doing enough of these interviews. Some of the most well-known practitioners and teachers today got their start because a copy of Siddhartha by Hermann Hesse was left on a beach, and that instigated their journey. Or, on an LSD trip in San Francisco or Afghanistan or wherever else, they met someone who knew someone who had taken some course somewhere, and that idea always remained in them. And this is long before the days of internet searches and Google and YouTube and everything else. This is really fringe in the full meaning of the word. And you, as this technique, as well as the wider mindfulness, meditation, Eastern practices, including yoga, as this whole thing started to become more and more normalized in this country, and especially in your region in the Northeast, in that time, what you had found as something so fringe that you didn't know anyone doing it. No one even really understood it. And it went from that to being something, you said it perfectly, something that was corporate, that was that people were coming from all over, coming from working class backgrounds, and it was starting to grow before you. So what if any feeling did that have for you? And I say if any because I think some people could be more affected by this growth and this sense of validation and this sense of everything coming together, and I think others would. I think there's other personality types that wouldn't affect them much. They're doing their practice and they're noticing this happen. So what if any influence did this type of growth and validation and wider practice start to do to you in your practice, in your life, in your integration, your sense of purpose, and everything else?
Yeah. I mean, I think, by this time in my life, I had already articulated an idealism around, the personal is political, that inner transformation, is going to be part and parcel of what helps to transform the world. I had this idealism around transforming the world. And so I think I personally did need to see impact beyond just my own experience and a small group of people. I think that is just part of who I am. And although I may not have been fully aware of it at the time, that was in operation, there was aspirations around that. And I didn't know what that looked like, or and also, I was also, becoming aware of course, some of the restrictions within the Goenka framework. There were a lot of rules and regulations around not mixing techniques that I became aware of with other traditions. There were stipulations around sitting the longer retreats around that, around being a volunteer on a course. And so I was having also to grapple with that, wanting a kind of to see a larger impact happen, but feeling like the organization had these strictures in place that actually prevented some of that from happening. And so, but I it was funny because I think at the time I sort of took it as almost like a Rubik's cube or something to solve, some thing to figure out, because I appreciated why a lot of those rules and regulations were in place, in the sense that I see, okay, really to create this very rarefied, intensive, experience that happened in silence over 10 days. It does take a lot of structure and, you might say restriction or limitations or rules, to kind of to pull that off, to have that in place. And you needed, it seemed like you needed that to be there. But at the same time, there were a number of those rules that, didn't sit, I didn't understand. And I was coming into this having done psychotherapy before, being the son of a psychiatrist, and seeing that, also that there was, silos that were being articulated around the Dhamma versus, psychology, or Dhamma versus, doing social work in the world. I began to sort of see that, and I think the refrain I began to hear was, well, just doing 10-day courses, somehow this is all going to lead to a transformation of the world. And I questioned that, but I think at the same time was, what would be the right word? Trying to, I guess digest it as well. Is that true? Is that really the way it's going to go? Is it going to be this, only this totally inner transformational experience through 10-day courses that's going to ultimately transform, vast swaths of society, in terms of the ideals. And, so I struggle with that quite a bit, around, just some of the limitations that the organization had in terms of interacting outside, in mainstream society. And I began to perceive, of course, that there were many insular aspects of the organization at that time. And it seemed on some levels justifiable, because it was, I thought, okay, well, it's preserving this experience, this profound, deep, intensive, rarefied experience. So it has to have all these protections in place, But at the same time, I was detecting this siloing of other aspects of the world that, didn't make sense to me, and felt, overly protective. Let's just put it that way in the, beginning. And, I don't know, maybe I'm a rebel, at heart, but I, as much as I really appreciated all of the rules and regulations in some ways, I was also, I think I'm a rule breaker on some levels, and wanted to, see how some of this, how things could be done differently, basically. Yeah.
That's really interesting. And especially as we delve deeper into your journey in being a rebel and a rule breaker and someone who's questioning this. At the same time, it has to be mentioned, we haven't gotten into this. It's probably a good time to do it. You, two different tracks. One is the prisons. You mentioned an interest in social justice and prison reform and meditation in prisons. And you went to Donaldson Prison to actually deliver these courses as a representative within this maximum security that became a feature-length documentary. And at the same time, or perhaps not at the same time, but around this period as well, you go on to become a teacher and someone of the ultimate authority and responsibility and representative. And so I think these are a good moment to diverge and start to explore the greater responsibility you chose to take on with these pathways. Which of those do you want to take first? The work you did in the prison or the becoming a teacher?
Yeah, well, I mean, even the work working with correctional facilities, that was by the time, we got to Alabama, many years had transpired. I mean, I began to do outreach. So I was very fortunate because another trustee at the center sort of took me under his wing as a kind of a mentor, and was also interested in this correspondence I began with some inmates and some correctional facilities. And we thought, well, wow, could this happen? And we began to sort of do some outreach, writing, just cold call and writing to facilities and, sending the materials, the brochures and the pamphlets of the 10-day course, and just see if anything would stick. We began to do even presentations, but we didn't have a whole lot to convey in terms of this being sort of a mainstream or acceptable activity to happen in a correctional facility. We knew some folks had already begun to do that, and I'm thinking some of the some of the folks who really pioneered this work. And so I think what was a real breakthrough was that, India, Goenkaji himself had done, retreats in correctional facilities in India in 1975. So we were aware of the stories of I think there were 2 retreats that were given. And it was like, it just sort of dropped off, the map after that. It was sort of never taken up again. But then in the early 90s, by that time I was actually, in the early 90s, I was actually living at Goenkaji's center in India, his main center, the flagship center, Dhammagiri, just about 3 hours northeast of Mumbai, and was studying Pali, the language that the Indo-European language, Prakrit language that the earliest Buddhist scriptures were written down in, and so I was fully immersed in the organization then, and some of my mentors, teacher mentors, were I think what had happened there. There was a new inspector general of prisons in India, and she had come across vipassana through one of her correctional officers, and had invited ATs, Goenkaji and ATs, to go to what was then, I think, the largest correctional facility in India. It was a prison that held 10,000 inmates, and they put, I think, a course on initially for 100 inmates, and then a subsequent course was held for 300. And one of the teachers I was very close with went and conducted that retreat. He was one of the only, I think, Western teachers on conducting helping to conduct that course. And then subsequently there was another retreat held for 1,000, and that became the subject of an award-winning documentary. And so suddenly we had materials that we could, take to correctional facilities in this country. And so my good buddy Bruce Stewart and I were cold calling correctional facilities and doing presentations in front of, sometimes wardens or directors of treatment or security personnel, around the possibility of introducing a retreat. So that went on for about, I was doing outreach for, I think, about 10 or 12 years. And then suddenly there was another big break in Washington State, associated with the center there, whereby an old student who was actually a nurse practitioner inside I think it was a minimum security county jail facility, was convinced his superintendent of the facility to sit a retreat, and she did. And she then began implementing a program of 10-day courses in her facility that occurred for 5. I think it went on for about 5 years, and was the subject of research that, made it into the American Jail Association magazine. And so suddenly this was like, and then I went out to actually volunteer on one of those retreats. And so for the first time, I was experiencing what it was like to facilitate a retreat like that in this domain, in a correctional setting. After having done so much, kind of presentations and outreach to facilities here in the Northeast, which, were not flying because of different reasons. And so that was, I was definitely stepping out into the world with Vipassana and with Goenkaji's retreats. Yeah.
Right. So that's an opportunity to actually bring social justice reform directly into places through this Dhamma practice. And going, it sounds like for you, it was the result after many years and many attempts of trying to get in and finally finding places. And you played some small role in Washington and then a larger role in Alabama. And so then talk us through how this development went on and how, and as you started to get deeper into this process of bringing Dhamma, bringing the light of this meditation to some very dark places and people who had some, who had quite a bit of unhealed trauma in them, what that experience was like, and doing the thing that in some ways, you described you've been really called to do, to not just benefit from this yourself, but to use this in perhaps an idealistic or naive or innocent or maybe effective, depending on the way one's looking at it, hope that this will heal the world, that this is the thing that people need to get better. And as they get better and they get healed, they will in turn heal the society around them. This, I imagine, to large part, this is some of the motivation and intention in wanting wanting to bring this there. So talk a bit about that experience as you got deeper into this and you were able to effectively carry out some of these programs in very serious prisons.
Yeah, and it's interesting. It was definitely a social, it was moving into a sort of a social application of this, profound, transformative personal experience. And in many ways that dated back to, earlier parts of even my childhood, where I remember I watched a film where, it was about a wrongly accused person who was, sent to penal colonies, and then, spends the whole movie is about him trying to escape from that. But I remember feeling like early on, like, oh gosh, to be incarcerated, wrongly accused and incarcerated. But that began to, I think, also really, expand into a greater understanding of just incarceration and how in the United States and how it happens here. But it was interesting because as I began to enter into, correctional institutions, the whole notion of doing it for any kind of prison reform, I had to kind of put that aside in order to, we became aware as we became more involved with correctional facilities that correctional facilities were not interested in prison reform by any means, and certainly not in terms of social justice. And so, in some ways, I had to kind of reframe what I was doing to understand that, okay, we were going in, we were transforming lives within this institution that, obviously does a lot of harm. And so it was, trying to recalibrate that kind of sense of, inner work for outside transformation. And to be honest, I would say I was still very racially naive at the time that I was doing this. So I was compelled, it was clear for me that I wanted to bring, this retreat experiences to populations that would not normally have access to it. But I was naive to the settings that I was going into, to some of the social, racial, economic, injustice that had brought so many folks to these institutions. And so, although I was going in with my ideals, in some ways it was a mechanism and a vehicle for me to actually understand better my own ideals and understand my values and clarify them, and to undergo my own transformation around some of the, just understanding oppression in the world. And so the big breakthrough happened with Alabama. I think the retreats were continuing in Washington. We had several films that we were using, documentaries that were the one in, for India, there was one produced from the facility in Washington. And so, and then by this time, the whole field of mindfulness, of, particularly of John Kabat-Zinn's tradition of mindfulness-based stress reduction, was very mainstream. and the research that was happening, with those programs was published and legitimate, and we were using those research outcomes to justify, to convince, to persuade, to correctional facilities to consider implementing our 10-day retreat. And so what happened was kind of unusual. I mean, I got a call, out of the blue from someone who was a volunteer in the Alabama facility, and she said, "Listen, we'd like to set up a 10-day course, in the facility." And they've watched the Indian film Doing Vipassana, and the inmates themselves want this. They want this experience, and so how can we do this? And by this time I had done so much outreach that and was so aware of just the hurdles that had to be overcome to get a program inside a facility, that I just had to sort of apply the brakes right away and just say it's going to take time, and there's a number of conditions that have to be met, and the notion of somehow from Massachusetts that we would execute a program of retreats, within the highest maximum security prison in Alabama just seemed completely just out there to me. How is this possibly going to happen? And so much so that I actually didn't even mention it to any senior teachers for a long time because it was just so out there. But meanwhile, I began to have a conversation with this woman, Jenny Phillips, and she then introduced me to the psychologist at the facility, who then became the director of treatment for the state of Alabama. And then we were introduced to his replacement, who was the next psychologist, Dr. Deborah Marshall. And this whole process over about, I think it was about 2 years of conversations in terms of, the notion of bringing, what it would take. And then there was a big breakthrough, which was that, Dr. Marshall was able to corral a number of folks from the facility to come up to Massachusetts and attend a 10-day retreat. And at that point I thought, okay, they're serious. And at that point I had to, sort of spill the beans to my mentors, Rick Crutcher and Bruce Stewart, about who had already been doing prison outreach and conducting courses within facilities, and said, okay, there are these folks coming and they want to retreat and they're coming to sit. And so we were that much closer to, because that was one of the prerequisites that the people who had a decision-making authority in the facility needed to come and sit a 10-day retreat in order to understand what our setup was going to be inside the facility, because we were basically setting up a completely separate program that was completely separate from the general population, physically and residentially. And so they came, and then we went down there and inspected the site, which was the gymnasium. And after a few more hiccups, which was par for the course, about 6 months later, the first retreat happened. And Rick Crutcher, who was at that time the teacher for the center in Washington, who had been very instrumental in the correctional courses there, Bruce Stewart and myself, we went and served the course in Alabama for 10 days. And it was an incredible experience.
I mean, just to go on, your experience then of conducting that course is captured in Jenny Phillips' documentary, The Dhamma Brothers, which I would think many people that have tuned in this far have probably seen and are familiar with. And so the fact that this course happened and some of the things that are in the Dhamma Brothers, I don't think we have to go over here because that's already out in media, and encourage people to check that out who
Yeah.
haven't seen it. But I guess if you could just add some color to it, some behind the scenes, some personal reflections, inner transformations, things that left a lasting mark, just aside from the main contours of the story, which people might know because of the movie, what are some things you'd add to it?
Yeah. So, yeah, gosh, there's a lot to say about that experience. The film really does an incredible job of capturing what it was, what it felt like to Rick and Bruce and I. And at the same time, I want to underscore the fact that I went into into that experience really quite racially naive about my own identity as a privileged white man, and understanding really fully the context of oppression that leads to the kind of incarceration that's happening in places like Alabama. I went in really with a lot of ideals. In terms of the capacity to transform lives. And so I think that those experiences in Alabama really began a process for me where I both could appreciate aspects of the practice that enabled us, me as a white man, to bridge those differences, to bridge those gaps. And there was, one of the things that I think was very profound for the inmates just was the fact that these three white guys came in and were essentially, cooking and cleaning 24/7 after, so that they could meditate and have this profound experience. And then at the same time, we were meditating, 10 to 12 hours a day with them. So, there was just such an amazing level of gratitude and connection and between us that was just really quite amazing. It was really quite amazing for me to see, and in some ways, some of the Goenkaji says in his 10-day course, he's sort of a famous thing. He says, the breath isn't white, it's not black, it's not Chinese, it's not Russian. Sensations are not white, they're not black, they're not Chinese, they're not Russian, they're not and I felt on some level I was experiencing that on the retreat, sitting hour after hour after hour, with folks who were undereducated, underserved, and in some cases wrongly accused, inside the facility. And yet at the same time, I was also naive to the very, the differences and the different understanding of my own internalized dominance, their internalized oppression, their institutionalization. There were so many dynamics that I was not aware of that were also, I think, in operation. But it was nonetheless a very profoundly fulfilling experience. I remember thinking at the time, that this was happening, that I would, remember this on my deathbed as one of the most profound experiences of my life, just offering this to that population. And it was a real hellhole. I mean, it was a really, it was, if anyone's seen Shawshank Redemption, it was that kind of environment. It was just a really dark place. And it was just amazing to see us bring in a practice that brought light to these men. And I'll never forget, we went there, in January of 2002, and then we came back 6 months later maybe 5 months later in May. And it was the gymnasium, right? So, everything had been taken down and it reverted to a gymnasium. And then we were coming back and it was being reset up. And I walked into that gymnasium 6 months later, and I remember feeling a sense of comfort and just like a sense of familiarity, like I was at a Dhamma center as I walked into that gym. And it was so profound to feel that level of that we had somehow brought the kind of the safety of the vibration of a retreat center into a place like that. It was so moving to me. It was just profoundly moving to me. And then at some point, those of us who were involved early on, we felt like we needed to step away from the program in order to let other ATs conduct, and that because we had formed some very deep bonds with the guys, and that also came out in a kind of companion book called Letters from the Dhamma Brothers, which was their experiences writing about their retreats, I after that I again sort of took a break from that work, but in fact I ended up conducting the last retreat that was held there in 2020, just before COVID shut everything down, and the facility was being transformed into I think a psychiatric correctional facility. So that the program is no longer there after 17 years, but it was an amazing experience to go back after 17 years and have another whole experience there.
Yeah, that's great to get those behind the scenes and the real emotional impact you had in being able to deliver that. One thing I do want to ask about, you mentioned your naivete at the time of some of the racial discrimination and racial structures as you were delivering it, as well as the impact of how it felt having three white men completely caring for, supporting, and joining a Black population. On the other hand, another way to look at it that some African-American meditators have seen, and most notably Victoria Robertson on our podcast a couple of years ago. She's a former AT as well, African-American. And she described, in terms of watching the video of that, she described a sense of discomfort and hesitation in seeing a video. Well, two things. One is a video portraying white teachers that are giving some kind of instruction to incarcerated Black men on one hand, and then on the other hand, noting that when outreach was being done to show African Americans practicing meditation, the only thing that existed was African Americans who were behind prison, and that's an imagery that hits deep and can be traumatic to have. And so she describes, from being an African American practitioner, viewing white teachers and meditators showing other white teachers and meditators, primarily a video of white people teaching Black meditators, and just the whole discomfort that was around that, given the history and where it landed with them. And so I'm not saying this as as an either or disputing what you're saying. There can certainly be contrasts in which both are true, or many things are true at once, but more a reflection of what you think of that reaction. We should also say this is the reaction of one person. It certainly could be the reaction of more people in the community. We did have another African-American meditator that came on the podcast and said that he started meditating in the Goenka tradition because of Dhamma Brothers. And so, people certainly take it with different impressions, but the way Victoria took it and the way that other people, that other Black meditators similarly could take it, is that kind of discomfort. So I don't say that in any way to confront or dispute what you're saying, which is really valuable and lovely in itself, but offering up this kind of side-by-side contrast of another way that it could be viewed and that it's been viewed, and just your thoughts on that.
I would agree with Victoria. I mean, I think that the way that my racial naivete manifested was, in fact, going in there, and I'll just speak for myself, really in some ways with a very typical white savior mentality. I think in many ways I grew up with those kinds of images, and just stereotypical roles that, in terms of even my understanding of how oppression works in society. And, at that time, only saw that way, right? I was not perceiving the necessity for me to look at my own conditioning as a white male, and looking at the inherent privilege of that, the dominance of that. And so I would fully agree. And I think it's a both and, in the sense that there was benefit, and there continues to be benefit, I think, from students across the board, from all, races, seeing that film, being inspired by it. I think it speaks to something that's also universal, but I think the key here is that those universal pieces should not at all in any way deny the particulars around identity, around oppression and how it operates. And I think, I was fully caught up in that naiveté and that lack of awareness. And, to be honest, there's parts of the film where I cringe now looking at myself in terms of what I'm articulating in the film. And because I see that unexamined whiteness in operation, so I see both sides of it, and the portrayal, the film portraying African Americans, incarcerated African Americans, as our only portrayal of domestic, underrepresented domestic races in this country, attending courses is it's stereotypical, and it's not representational, and it's not, and it I think it continues to reinforce, those roles and those optics around that, and without it being examined.
Yeah, right. And I think that in her interview, Victoria also mentioned how she went to center management and senior teachers and expressed this pain, and had ideas and plans for other forms of outreach that could be done to depict Black meditators and show the power and the benefit of meditation in African American communities. And she describes a certain kind of reticence to that, and not just a reticence, but even a pointing to the film and to the project of saying, well, haven't we already done that? Isn't this already here? And just simply not hearing and understanding the pain that comes from some sectors, of course, because these things aren't monolithic, but certainly from some individuals voicing out their discomfort, and individuals within the organization mentioning that this on its own was uncomfortable. This was depicting something that was not felt to be helpful in expanding beyond a wide audience, and that it felt like it was more, in the way she described it, it felt like it was more of a tool that was being used to impress other white people. That look, it could even go here. It could even reach these people. And so, can you imagine how powerful it is and what it can do to reform the country and other kinds of problems? And so. And so I think the pain from her side was also in her growing role of responsibility as a teacher at that point, not having the capacity to be able to bring in these teachings in what she would feel would be a more appropriate way to her community.
Yeah, I fully agree with that. I think that, in lieu of the organization looking at some of the inequities, racial inequities in the organization, then this sort of on the surface, you might say, sort of charitable service was really in some ways reinforcing the very same structures of oppression that exist in the world. Right. And that's more clear to me now, but only because I underwent a process of really examining my whiteness and my conditioning as a white male, and looking at, educating myself around how oppression operates, and trying to understand from the lived experiences of folks who don't look like me, like what is this? Yeah, how does this land really? And so I do fully agree that that it perpetuates typical white dominant stereotypes around just that white savior mentality of we're going to fix this way, rather than examining the conditioning and the structures in society, and how, as white people, we play a role in perpetuating those structures by not examining our whiteness. And so, definitely the experiences there didn't. I don't. I don't. I don't. They didn't lead directly to that. There were other influences in my life that led to doing that work. But then when I began to, and it was, again, it was another level of introspection that actually was as profound, I think, as receiving the Dhamma, as when I began to undertake sort of extended anti-racism training, and looking at reading and looking at the conditioning that I, as a white male, have inherited and continue to perpetuate. And it was eye-opening for me in a way that was as profound as sitting with some of my first Sunday courses. And I think at some point I began to then look at the organization, because the organization, continued to say, well, okay, how come we're not, how come this is not happening in African American communities, and how do we do African American outreach? And I could see that, well, there's, Victoria was a standalone. I mean, she was a senior assistant teacher, but she was an exception, right, to the rule of an African American, being appointed into a senior leadership role in the organization at the time, and so, I think it was around. It was, I forget when it began to happen. I think it was in around 2014 and 2015, I began to see that, that the work that I had begun to do, looking at, white patterns and microaggressions and implicit bias, within myself, I needed to see how that was playing out in the organization. And that, as I, began to look at it, it was confusing at first. I thought, okay, well, wait a second, the tradition levels the playing field because it doesn't charge for courses. So,
right.
But again, the question of, okay, who has access, right? And it seems like, that access is certainly facilitated by it being on a donation basis. But then why didn't we have more assistant teachers of color on the dais? Why doesn't your average African American or Latino who's coming to sit a course see someone who looks like them on the dais? And why was the diversity of the tradition? There was a lot of diversity in terms of Asian. The Asian communities and coming to sit, but and they were, I could see, over the time that I was in the organization, I could see that they were being given appointments, as ATs, assistant teachers, or senior assistant teachers, or in some cases full teachers, and the same thing wasn't happening, with the, in the Latino or African American community. And as I began to, look at that more carefully, I realized, okay, there are actually inequities within the organization that I needed to I needed to articulate. I needed to articulate to myself, and then I needed to articulate to, because at this point I was an assistant teacher, and was really critically looking at how whiteness was manifesting in the tradition.
And it's so fascinating, some of these things that we're breaking down, because if you just go back and look at that Donaldson prison and the accompanying Dhamma brothers, it's like there are these parallel arguments that both work within their own frame of argumentation, and they're somewhat, maybe completely paradoxical and contradictory, and yet to really understand this issue, you kind of have to have the maturity to be able to hold both of these views at the same time and start to dissect them, whether to just rush to defend one or debunk the other. For example, just hearing the things that you said, there's very opposing views I could put side by side that you have, and you've supported both of them. Someone could call you out for being hypocritical, but I don't think that's the case. I think it's that both of these are operating somewhere simultaneous. One of those views is that the breath is not black, it's not white, it's not Russian, it's not Chinese, it's breath is breath, human is human. And this is a beautiful, profound truth, which is getting at the core of the mind-body relationship. It's moving outside of identity, not just identity in terms of race or nationality or caste or whatnot, but identity of old or young, man, woman, or even emotional identities of I'm not the kind of person who can, or I am the kind of person who likes to, etc. I mean, it's really ripping off this whole veneer of identity, and that ripping off of identity can also lead to confusions with racism not existing, because you could say, well, if identity and ego don't exist, how can racism exist? That's a whole other Pandora's box to open, which I'm not going there. But to just stay on that moment,
we're going there.
Eventually, another episode. This one's winding to a close, but on that particular topic, this is a profound truth that you are practicing something which is meant to transcend these issues of identity and not just transcend identity, but bring enormous benefit. And I don't think anyone could look at the outcome of this course and hear from the prisoners themselves on the documentary or in the book and think that they did not benefit tremendously on a human level from this course taking place. And these are all beautiful things which not just in some ways transcend these divisions of race, but offer a promise into a new place we can go with them. Yet on the other hand, you talk about the optics of the optics, not just because it happened, which is one thing, but the fact that a feature film is made about it, and then the feature film is used in certain ways. So optics is really the correct word of this kind of having white people in positions of power and the black prisoners who are benefiting, the black meditators who are benefiting, are incarcerated in prison. And they are in a position of more or less passively receiving and being grateful to the white teachers. This is, and not putting people of color in positions where they're also decision makers and carrying this out. And, this is the classic Hollywood trope of anytime you want to talk about a non-white world, you need to have a white figure in the middle of it. You need to have a white protagonist. They're not going to buy it if the protagonist affecting the change, the agent of change, is a person of color themselves. And so this is fitting into that whole trope. It's even going back further, if you really want to go there, it's fitting into the European conquest of the world in the form of Christian missionaries, and legitimately feeling we are bringing them civilization. We are bringing them salvation. We are bringing the truth that we have, that these heathens have been denied, and we are showing them this light. There's some connection there to make. It's very uncomfortable, and it also doesn't completely stand, because the prisoners themselves at the end talk about the enormous benefit they get. But it does harken back to this. And if you want to stay with the Goenka motif, it reminds me of speaking to Ujagara, who is a noted meditation teacher, a monk from Canada, formerly a Goenka teacher. I remember at one point him telling me that he accompanied I don't know if Goenka himself was leading it or if it was just senior teachers within the Goenka tradition. I don't remember that part, but it was one of their very first visits to Sri Lanka. And they turned to Ujagara and he was a layperson at that time, and said, and just I don't remember who this was, a senior teacher, or I think it might have been someone very close to Goenka at the time, said something with this joy. We're and I don't remember the exact words of it. Something like, we are finally bringing them this light of liberation to their land. And that was the moment that Ujagara left the organization and never looked back. He was horrified and ashamed to hear that they were going to a country that had been Buddhist for and had their own traditions for countless years, and these were from, even though these were Indians saying it, he felt like this horrible kind of overtone of colonialism that was bringing light to the natives in that way. And so these might be kind of extreme examples to make. And I'm not making these examples. I'm not fighting. I'm not trying to make a battle on the hill of these examples, because they don't stand. They're not really parallel to what you were doing, but they are an extension of that. I think they do have to be said. They do have to be held. And this fits with the Goenka movement. It fits with white people in positions of power and privilege as well, that you have this incident where, and again, I keep having to emphasize, it's not just the incident alone, which would be another thing. It's the way the incident was then put into book and documentary form, and the way that book and documentary was then utilized. That's what made it bigger than it was. And there's a way that it's just fascinating to see to hold these two things side by side and try to make sense of them, that you're doing something which is transcending race, is transcending racism, is providing tangible benefit to the people that are undergoing it, who want it, who are calling out for it, who are grateful for it, benefiting from it, and is showing a possible way forward for humanity and for some of the social problems that we're facing. And yet, on the other hand, is also being perceived and having connotations that are quite uncomfortable. And so one is not looking to prove a point of one argument versus the other, but just to hold them both there. And I don't know how you make sense out of them rather than just to acknowledge that they exist on some form.
Yeah, I think holding them both is really actually important. And there's a lot of polarities that you're holding together, I think, and you're doing it in a space there's a lot of gray area and nuance, but I want to, one thing I want to sort of go back to is, so, describing that, that experience of sitting in Alabama with the inmates and feeling, this just visceral connection, this, you might even say vibrational connection and safety, in terms of all of us meditating together in the same room and doing this work together and experiencing the benefit. And so I there's no way that I can deny that sort of, you might say, universal or, bridging experience that was going on. And the particulars are also still there. The particulars of the, racial structures that were in play there, the biases, the discrimination, that was also all there at the same time. So, I remember, as I mentioned earlier, like this Goenkaji quoting, the breath isn't black, the breath isn't white, and thinking, that's the universal framework here, right? But I have a very different sense of that now, because now I understand. I understand structural racism as intergenerational. That there is, trauma, racialized trauma that is embedded in both, in black and brown and white bodies all together, right? And I'm thinking of a book I read called My Grandmother's Hands, which is about, and the subtitle, Racialized Trauma and the Pathway to Mending Hearts and Minds. And it's looking at the effects of, generations of oppression, of racism, structural racism, and how that has affected our bodies. So now I would say that, even our breaths and our sensations are conditioned by this level of trauma. And, that also has to be addressed, without generalizing. I think that folks of color who come to retreats are processing at another level when they come to a retreat, and particularly if there is not a teacher of color on the dais, who can, understand some of the experiences. I mean, I think that there are folks who are processing everyday racism, folks of color who are processing everyday racism when they come to their retreats, right? And to say that wasn't happening with the inmates at Alabama or any inmates, would be just completely naive, right? But I think it's not just the naivety that I had or that my colleagues had in going in there as white folks, delivering this program. It was a naivete and a bias of the whole organization as a whole, in terms of how folks of color can access the 10-day retreats, but the pathways to assuming positions of responsibility or leadership, perceived leadership, to becoming an assistant teacher, which is really the leadership entity in the organization, whether you're just an assistant teacher, a senior assistant teacher, or a full teacher. Those are the positions of leadership. And so the fact that, what I began to see, okay, what are the barriers here to, for a person of color to, after sitting a retreat, then to take the same pathway that I took as a privileged white man. I was able to take enormous amounts of time off to do these retreats. Well, that's completely reflective of the privilege I have, not only economically, but racially. Right. And so, I think that, again, let me see, how do I want to say this? Like, I think, well, just going back to, Victoria's example, I think she was at that time an exception. There weren't many African Americans being appointed to be assistant teachers at that time. And why was that the case? That was what I was asking. Well, the reality is, to become an assistant teacher, you have to sit, many, many, many 10-day courses and many long retreats, right? 30 days, 45, 20 days, 30 days, 45 days. And then you also have to put in the time of service, so that you understand what's going on, so all those things add up to a lot of, let's just say, socioeconomic time, right? And if you look at the wealth disparities in the United States, people of color have, on average, 1/10 of the wealth of white folks. So those are the societal racial barriers, right? But then, at some point, you have to look at your organization and say, okay, well, how do we then provide access? If we really want to impact Latino and African American communities, domestic, communities of color in this country, then we have to have leaders, who are made up of those identities to do that. It can't be, again, white folk going into those communities and saying, oh, here's this great technique, because that's just the same thing that I did going to Alabama, right? And so, I think what and I was really, I listened to your interview with Mike Ford, and I was really interested in that because by that time, some of the centers were bringing in anti-racism training, but I remember, the question for me was, how do we create alternative tracks or tracks so that folks of color who cannot necessarily give all that amount of time can still take positions of responsibility and leadership in the organization in order to represent their communities. And I still don't, the response has, since Victoria was an assistant teacher in the tradition, has been to now put on Black heritage courses. And that is actually a big accomplishment, because when she was an assistant teacher, that was denied at the very senior levels of leadership. And not only that, but North American assistant teachers tried to stop it from happening elsewhere. So Goenkaji conducted the first African heritage course in India, and but there was a lot of protests from senior leadership here in this country for that happening. And I just think that again it's emblematic of this notion, these sort of notions of sort of universal truths or universal values kind of superseding the need to attend to the particulars, and not to dismiss the particulars of what is going to allow for more access. And so, now the response is to do more courses with Black heritage courses, but I don't know that that's necessarily going to produce any more assistant teachers unless the organization implements other functions that bridge those inequities, and bridge and create more inclusion. So there's a lot of stuff that can happen on an organizational level. Just number one, just tracking demographics, in the organization. So the organization does not track, as far as I still know, any racial demographic information of its participants. So for me, the question is, well, if that's the case, how can they communicate to those populations, right? How can they just do any kind of surveying of those populations' experience of coming to the retreat centers? And that's a huge gap. That's a huge gap of missing information. But then, another, I think, piece is, preparing white assistant teachers and senior assistant teachers and teachers about the context of what people of color experience every day in navigating a white world, and that's actually happening when they come to our retreat centers. So educating, the primarily white leadership to their own bias and conditioning around being white, and what they're not seeing in terms of the lived experiences of students of color who come to the retreats. I think that's a really huge piece. I think that's beginning to happen, but needs to happen in a much more sanctioned way. And when it began to happen, it was also dismissed and minimized. But I think there is momentum gaining now, from what I understand, with affinity groups and that are learning together and coming to understand how things could potentially change. So, the other thing is just understanding that socioeconomically it's going to be, on average, it's going to be difficult for folks of color who do not have wealth to then spend the kinds of time that are requisites to demonstrating that you are willing to be a representative of the organization, that you've understood, the practice enough to articulate it, that you've done enough long courses to understand the sensitivities of students undergoing them, so that you could actually guide them through that process. So if it takes so much time, and on average, folks of color have 1/10 of the wealth, access, privilege, and all the other racial barriers that prevent them from even attending a 10-day course, from taking the time to attend a 10-day course. I mean, my feeling is, a person of color who rolls up to one of Goenkaji's centers, or any Dharma center for that matter, has done twice the work of any white person to get there. And, just in terms of all the statistics and research that's out there around, the experience, all the benchmarks, right? I mean, from birth to grave, of all the inequities that people of color face in terms of education, in terms of workplace, in terms of supervision, in terms of wages, in terms of their proximity to and experience of incarceration, their experiences with the criminal justice system. I mean, you name it. Starting from birth, birth data to early death, right? While being a person of color. I mean, these are all the barriers that go into why we don't have more Dharma teachers of color. And I speak, I'm speaking also to not just Goenka's tradition. I think what's going on there is similar to many Dharma organizations. But I think that the potential is greater there, because the field has been leveled, at least in terms of you don't have to pay an exorbitant fee to get in, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's quite a bit there. And I I know from experience of before the pandemic, when we took on the series of examining Dhamma and race and having a number of guests from different Buddhist and meditator backgrounds, I would venture to say we've rarely received that intense of feedback on other of the 150 shows we've done now, anything comparable to that in both directions. We had meditators coming from all backgrounds, people of color as well as white people, just thanking us effusively and so appreciative that we were giving attention to this topic and covering it, and really how it was educating and inspiring people of different backgrounds to think about how to work on this issue and to be conscious of it. And even to this day, I mean, just a couple months ago, these episodes aired years ago, I had a meditator, I should say the background because all of this matters, a white meditator from England, I think it was, tell me that he's listened to some of this interview with Clyde Ford probably a dozen times. He says every month or two he listens to it again because he gets something else out of it in terms of how meditation can play a role in social justice and racism. And yet we've also had the other side. We've had people that have written in accusing me personally of wanting to play a race card in order to make this podcast popular and just try to stir up controversy where none exists, and warning me that I'm incurring very bad karma for this greed for popularity. People accusing or then the age old argument of just that because there's no identity to begin with, there's no ego in Buddhism and in meditation, that there simply can't be race, and so you're focusing on something which by definition can't exist, and very vehement arguments both ways. I mean certainly the people that were those that were unhappy that we were taking this topic on at all were extremely unhappy and voicing it in very aggressive tones of how wrong it was to how wrong-headed and even damaging it was to even begin to approach this, and then just the extraordinary gratitude and inspiration that people felt and that we were handling it. So I definitely know, just from having touched that on our platform before, what it stirred up and what it caused. And we're just getting into this now, and this is probably a good time to start to put a pin in this conversation, to have it continue. As we were talking more about your work on the prisons, I was going to segue into your role as a teacher, which fit into that. But as we started to go deeper into the aspect of prisons, we also went deeper into the aspects of race and racism and that intersection, that whole topic and world. And so rightly so, we continued down that lane, and that's what this episode will be. So, next time we talk, I'm sure, again, we'll continue to revisit these discussions about race and racism, your involvement, your growth. I mean, you mentioned your, I don't remember the words you used to describe it, but the light bulb going off in terms of the first meditation sitting was comparable to learning about white privilege and structural racism. So certainly that'll be something we return to in society and meditation and Buddhism in the Goenka organization specifically, as well as your taking on the role of teacher, not a light topic, what it meant to be a teacher, how it felt to administer those duties and to be able to serve on a much greater level and to take on not just more responsibility, but also more agency in how what you did from the dais, what you were allowed to do, and then how you were able to do what you wanted anyway, and to find a way to reach students and guide them through meditation practice, a big part of your story, as well as better understanding the experiences in the Goenka organization and everywhere else this is going. So I think covered a lot of ground today and some really valuable stuff.
Yeah, we might have skipped some steps too, but I really appreciate the opportunity, and I look forward to continuing the conversation, Joa. And in some ways, there's important pieces to put in place to understand, why this became such an important perspective for me, and ultimately why, one of the reasons why I left the organization. So I look forward to exploring that with you, and holding, all the polarities together. I think that's a really important piece to do here. Yeah.
We'd like to take this time to thank our generous supporters who have already given. We simply could not continue to provide you with this content and information without the wonderful support of generous donors, listeners, and friends like you. Each episode helps in providing access to one more voice, one more perspective, one more insight. Every donation of any size is greatly appreciated and helps us continue this mission. We greatly appreciate your generosity, which allows us to maintain this platform. Thank you. If you would like to join in our mission to support those in Myanmar who are being impacted by the military coup, we welcome your contribution in any form, currency, or transfer method. Your donation will go on to support a wide range of humanitarian and media missions, aiding those local communities who need it most. Donations are directed to such causes as the Civil Disobedience Movement, CDM, families of deceased victims, internally displaced person IDP camps, food for impoverished communities, military defection campaigns, undercover journalists, refugee camps, monasteries and nunneries, education initiatives, the purchasing of protective equipment and medical supplies, COVID relief, and more. We also make sure that our donation fund supports a diverse range of religious and ethnic groups across the country. We invite you to visit our website to learn more about past projects, as well as upcoming needs. You can give a general donation or earmark your contribution to a specific activity or project you would like to support, perhaps even something you heard about in this very episode. All of this humanitarian work is carried out by our nonprofit mission, Better Burma. Any donation you give on our Insight Myanmar website is directed towards this fund. Alternatively, you can also visit the Better Burma website, betterburma.org, and donate directly there. In either case, your donation goes to the same cause, and both websites accept credit card. You can also give via PayPal by going to paypal.me/betterburma. Additionally, we can take donations through Patreon, Venmo, GoFundMe, and Cash App. Simply search Better Burma on each platform and you'll find our account. You can also visit either website for specific links to these respective accounts or email us at info@betterburma.org. That's Better Burma, one word, spelled BETTERBURMA.org. If you would like to give it another way, please contact us. We also invite you to check out our range of handicrafts that are sourced from vulnerable artisan communities across Myanmar, available at alokacrafts.com. Any purchase will not only support these artisan communities, but also our nonprofit's wider mission. That's Aloka Crafts, spelled ALOKACRAFTS, one word, alokacrafts.com. Thank you so much for your kind consideration and support.
na Visaya. Whatever Yarananga Unyana, Daduya Danandari Zadamana, we got a Visaya na Visaya. Oba Yarananda Dayananga, Yaranaya, Dayanam, Boda, Yaranamano, Daduya.